The information and opinions presented in this Arc Energy Ideas podcast are provided for informational purposes only and are subject to the disclaimer link in the show notes.
This is the Arc Energy Ideas podcast with Peter Tertzakian and Jackie Forrest, exploring trends that influence the energy business.
Welcome to the Arc Energy Ideas podcast. I'm Jackie Forrest.
And I'm Peter Tertzakian. Well, day after election.
Yeah, we're all a little bit tired because those votes took forever to come in.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. You know, we've got all this AI talk and modern computational science, and we can't seem to get election results. I don't know, like there was scanning the ballots on some fancy machine. And
I thought it was going to be faster because of that.
Whatever.
But obviously not. But we did eventually get an answer, although I think the final numbers are still going to come in over the next few days.
So we're going to talk about election, right? What else are we talking about? We're talking about what's going on in Texas. We're talking about, we're hiring someone.
Yeah, so ARC is hiring. We're looking for a senior research analyst to lead our oil and gas research, Canadian focus. Of course, we believe there's a dual track to the energy transition. There'll be a lot of investment in clean energy, but oil and gas will be needed for a long time too. So we're looking for someone to help us out to track everything that's going on with Canadian oil and gas, which is quite a lot.
So you'll post that on the...
Yeah, I'll put a link to the job posting in the show notes, and please check it out or send it to those in your network that might be interested. We'd really appreciate your help.
Okay, good.
Other news, Peter's an artist.
I am. I can now add that to my resume. I am having a show at Elevation Gallery in Canmore, June 10th. The show is going to be up for 3 weeks, showcasing my collection of vintage light bulbs and the art that has been produced from it. So if you're in Canmore on the 10th, it's a Saturday, 3 o'clock, I'll be presenting on it, and the show and the artwork will be up for 3 weeks.
Well, I will be there, but we all have this question, Peter. How do you have time to do all this stuff that you do?
Well, there's 26 hours in a day, Jackie.
Yeah, I know. I need to figure out how to use those hours that I'm sleeping the way you do. All right. Well, talking about not sleeping, the election. So Danielle Smith, UCP, wins a majority last night. Now, the numbers can change a little bit, but the last I saw, UCP had about 49 seats confirmed, and the NDP 38.
Yeah.
And Edmonton was all orange. Calgary was a slightly more NDP than UCP, like almost half and half, but just a little bit more for the NDP. However, not enough seats there for the NDP to get the majority. They needed more in Calgary.
Yeah.
And the rural, outside of the major cities, with just a few exceptions, was all UCP.
Yeah. I mean, this is very much a rural-dominated vote. Many ministers in the UCP lost their seats in the cities. To be a comfortable win, I would have said the UCP needs 50 plus. We're at 49. You needed 44, actually, to have a majority in an 87-seat parliament. It's certainly a win, but it's a very polarized win, and I think that will have some implication to energy policy, particularly oil and gas being a rurally dominated win. I would say that speaks to the favor of a lot of the conventional oil and gas workers who are spread all across the province, and their interests are likely to be well represented by the UCP.
Yeah, no, that's true. You can see that. And I mean, and some support in Calgary, right, which is more dominated by the oil and gas industry in terms of the corporate jobs as well.
Yeah. Although, I mean, Calgary is split. Edmonton's completely shut out. I don't think this is a very healthy dynamic for Edmonton to be shut out. I think we're going to be watching, obviously, who the ministers are appointed, including the energy minister and the environment minister. Those two are most relevant to the energy policy. But the bench strength for ministerial selection is a lack of experience, it would strike me. Now, we've been there before. The NDP had a tremendous dearth of experience back when they won in I think it was the 2015 election. So, I mean, it's been done before. It's more like, okay, this is a new reality, going to be a new, fresh government. And then I think Danielle Smith will have a challenge without, I think, a really compelling majority to manage the various factions of the Conservative Party, the United Conservative Party, because this is also a big deal in many democracies right now, where you have either the right or the left, and within the right and the left, there's fractures and splits and so on. And so how that is going to be managed is going to be something that is going to be very consequential to the future of the province and certainly the energy business.
Well, and a strong opposition, a bigger opposition than we've ever had in Alberta.
The biggest one we've ever had. Yeah.
I mean, I don't mind that. I mean,
No.
Having a big opposition, having a lot of resources to be able to question the government, I think helps come to better answers than would be otherwise.
Yeah, I think the accountability is going to be far greater than in elections past. Certainly the elections, I would say circa, the late 90s into the 2000s was foregone conclusion the Conservative Party was going to win. It was just whether it was going to be a landslide. And I think even in one election, I can't remember which one, the question was whether or not it was going to be a complete shutout. Those days are behind us. The Alberta electorate is a lot more, I'd call it, diverse across the political spectrum. So this split does speak to a greater opposition. I think to repeat, I think the uncomfortable thing is it's sort of a polarized opposition, very much urban versus rural.
We did get some sense last night from the Premier's speech after the results were tabulated. And I do think energy will be the top of the agenda. That is actually one of the few things she actually talked about around policy. She talked about the harmful policies coming from the Trudeau government on the cap on oil and gas emissions, as well as this electricity by net zero by 2035. She asked the Prime Minister to halt these policies and come to Alberta and work with Alberta to make their reduction plan, which is going to be, achievable reductions in a time frame that makes sense. Also wants to include using LNG and other technologies as part of that to make those reductions. So asking the feds to put down their pens, scrap what they've been working on and start anew. So we'll see how that goes. I mean, if that could happen, that would be a great result if we could work collaboratively and find a way for things like natural gas and LNG to be part of the plan.
Yeah, I would say, knowing what I know, there was already plenty of collaborations that were going on behind the scenes. So I think there's going to be a continuation of that. What's interesting, and we mentioned this on a previous podcast, is you have to think about the different parties that are in I'll call it the negotiation. There's the resource owner, which is Alberta. And now with this election behind us, the resource owner is definitely wanting to be at the negotiating table. That was not so much the case in the final, we'll call it 9 months of the Kenney era, because there was so much turmoil within the party that there was almost like a reality TV show watching the federal government, which is obviously another stakeholder, and the industry itself, and a subset of the industry, the oil sands segment, negotiating with each other. Now we have a multi-party situation where the resource owner, Alberta, on behalf of Albertans, is definitively going to be at the negotiating table with the federal government. And now we have the oil and gas industry also there, but the oil and gas industry has two distinct extraction modalities. One is the oil sands and the other is the conventional oil and gas, which is spread all across the rural parts of Alberta, which is why it's significant that it was pretty much a sweep, other than, I think, Banff, Kananaskis.
Lethbridge, the one seat in Lethbridge, too.
And one seat in Lethbridge that was taken by the NDP.
Yeah. Now, so that rural and the conventional industry is going to factor in here. I did want to mention, too, Chris Varco from the Calgary Herald did have an interview with Danielle Smith late last week after our podcast. And there was some new information about future direction of policy. One of the questions we talked about last week is, are they going to pay for carbon capture storage, the Alberta government? Danielle Smith did say in that interview they want to expand the petrochemical incentive program to include CCS, and they plan to use more tier funding. They don't want this to come out of general tax revenues. So they don't want to give tax incentives the way the federal government did, but they want to see how they can use that. So we'll learn more about that. We did also learn that, remember that $100 million for the R-Star, which was a way to create incentive for oil and gas companies to clean up their wells. She did say that that's on hold for now. The existing system that the UCP actually put in place of spending 3% of your liability, reducing that each year by 3% is what they're going to continue with. And they're going to monitor that and see if that's working.
Yeah, well, I hope they leave it alone, because I'm speaking from my own personal experience with the royalty review. The royalty review led to a fiscal policy construct that was, I would call it, fairly comprehensive, fairly focused, completely re-engineered from the 1937 onward fiscal policies. And I think to mess around with it and complicate it again into a patchwork quilt would be a mistake, whether it's for cleaning up abandoned wells or whether it's messing around with the royalty formulas to accommodate carbon capture and so on. Those should be treated as separate policies, and I think the royalty policy should be kept pure.
All right. Well, hey, then it looks like that's the direction for now, assuming that the current system does work to reduce the liabilities. The other thing I wanted to mention was renewables. Now, Danielle Smith made some comments during the election, with favorable views for natural gas, that we need to have more natural gas generation in the province because it makes sense and it creates reliability. She also made some comments around renewables, that she's supportive of solar and wind projects where they make sense. But she says, I can tell you from my conversations with people in my own community that putting solar panels on prime agricultural land does not make sense. So we'll wait and see kind of what happens in the power system, if there's some changes there. I mean, right now we have an open system that doesn't sort of dictate that we need to build a certain amount of natural gas or wind or solar, and we'll see if that changes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Danielle Smith's government is anti-renewables more than it is supportive of natural gas or baseload generation. I think this issue of landowners, farmers, ranchers, and others being against the use of their land being taken up by solar panels and wind farms is a big issue. And we're going to talk about that because it's already starting to have some sort of a backlash in Texas.
Yeah, well, let's I mean, that's really all I had. Kind of, we're going to see what the UCP has. I really think it's going to be continuing with their work. A lot of that outlined in that emissions reduction and energy development plan, including, plans to work on hydrogen and geothermal, and even some talk in there that we might start looking at things like blending a certain amount of renewable natural gas into our gas. So we'll wait and see. I think we're going to see more about those plans over time. But let's switch topics to what's going on in Texas. Now, Texas has been a clean energy pioneer, a lot like Alberta. There's been a lot of growth in renewables there. And they welcomed wind and solar for many years. But recently that's changed. Now the state Republican politicians are putting forward new legislation that would disadvantage wind and solar. Yesterday, Monday, May 29th, was the last day of their legislative session. And many of these bills didn't make it through, but a few did. So they've actually gone forward with a bill that would add transmission costs to certain renewable projects. It would require renewables to subsidize the construction of new fossil plants called firming plants. And it would make renewables pay higher fees for ancillary services. So there was some really more harmful measures that were proposed, like a more difficult permitting program for renewables and other types of energy development that didn't go through. But I think we wanted to talk about, what's changed in Texas and what, compared to before when they were very pro-renewables, what has changed and what that might mean for other jurisdictions when we think about it rolling out over the rest of the U.S. and even into areas of Canada. And this is based on this Wall Street Journal article, which we will put a link to in the show notes.
It's not only the Wall Street Journal. There are many other articles. And so I have to defer to the articles because I have not been down in Texas and have not talked with the legislators or others. But I actually think this is an issue that is beyond Texas. It's something that's happening more broadly in terms of a pushback against renewables because of the landowners or people with a view. They don't want wind turbines off the coast or in the pristine mountain foothills where the wind blows and we put these things up. And so I think that this sentiment that is brewing, and of course gets latched onto by more of the pro-fossil fuel sides of political governments, wherever they may be in the Western world. I think this is a broader trend and puts forth a limiting factor on the rate of renewable growth. So what am I saying is that, you look at every projection for growth of renewables up until now, and it's like a hockey stick going straight upward. And that's somewhat justifiable because it does look like a hockey stick between, say, circa 2009 to today. However, the extrapolation of that as a exponential growth is not necessarily warranted because there are limiting factors, and in this case, pushback by landowners and others that don't want to see this stuff either take up arable land or ruining their view or making too much sound or too much lights at night because there's all sort of flashing lights on wind turbines, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, and I think in Texas, I think that's definitely a big part of it, the opposition from local landowners. I think there's some other nuances too. The Texas power crisis in 2021, which we covered on the podcast, which was blamed, maybe rightly or wrongly, I think somewhat wrongly, on renewable energy. So I think that's part of it. But I also think there's this sort of anti-ESG movement that was already taking hold in places like Texas. For example, the government has declared pension funds can no longer invest in any ESG-focused funds, and they've got even a list of organizations you can't be investing in anymore. And I think wind and solar might be getting caught up with that. It's almost like clean energy is now associated with being democratic.
It's a symbol of the anti-ESG movement.
So if you're into oil and gas, then you're against everything else, that sort of movement. And so I think that's a little concerning too. But let's go through that one about the local landowners. We did just talk about Danielle Smith's comments leading up to the election. And I would just say, that isn't a situation that is unique to Texas. And I think the thing with Texas is as they're getting more and more land footprint taken up by wind and solar, you're starting to see more concerns. In fact, there was a quote in this Wall Street Journal article that said, these solar farms look like absolute crap. And if you have a wind turbine that you can see from your property, it reduces the land value. Those are some of the sentiments in that article. And we actually had a project near High River here in Alberta that was turned down by the Alberta Utilities Commission. And a lot of that was rejected because of concerns around the impact on bird life and the footprint of the project. So this is not an issue that's only in Texas.
Well, I was going to say it's not only in Texas. It's not only in Alberta. It's all across the continent and beyond. Because anywhere where there is pristine land and you want to take that land and convert it into a solar farm or a wind farm, there's a certain amount of land that is willingly offered for the development of these projects. And then all of a sudden you start running into the landowners that say, wait a minute, I don't want this. So I think you're going to see more resistance to this kind of thing, which has the potential to slow the curve. And also then on top of it, I would say the anti-ESG movement just picks up on all this.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's, sure, you could put your wind or solar farm on different land, maybe land that is further away and doesn't conflict so much with agricultural land. But it always costs more, right? Now you need bigger transmission lines to come from further distances. So it slows things down and likely causes them to cost more. Yeah. I really think that we need to start thinking about putting, especially things like solar, on urban landscapes that we've already impacted the land footprint. However, those generally cost quite a bit more than, just laying them out like Lego pieces on big tracts of land, right? So the Texas power crisis, I think, is unique, but it does get to some of the comments made by Danielle Smith around the reliability and the concerns as we increase the amount of renewables. Are we going to have a reliable power market? And what they're discussing in Texas is a capacity market where, and regardless of how much they produce, certain types of generators are going to get capacity payments. And the NDP had actually suggested this in Alberta before they lost to the UCP in 2019. And it may be needed as we get higher and higher rates of renewables and the price of power maybe gets driven down because of that. Other types of generators may not want to build ones that can be available 24/7. So the idea is you give them a certain amount of money just to be there, to be on standby. But there's a lot of concerns with this in that, especially in a 100% free market, it's no longer a 100% free market. So it can give an advantage to generators that get the firm payment. It can have unintended consequences, such as less clean energy coming in because it doesn't have the same return as the types of generation that get these capacity payments.
Yeah, well, what's really happening is the disruption of the evolution of a century of electrical power grid growth. And so making a radical shift in the way the electricity is produced and the characteristics of that electricity. So in other words, intermittency of wind and solar versus the constancy of baseload power, such as natural gas-fired or coal-fired generation, means that if you change the system dramatically over a short period of time, and a short period of time is like 10 years, then all of a sudden you introduce distortions in the market. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to have a guest come on and talk about all this. He's an electricity trader And right at the ground floor of how the electricity floor, he's going to talk about the impact of renewables onto the grid here and elsewhere.
All right, we'll wait for that. Okay, well, we'll wrap up this section. The last section for this podcast, we want to talk about some listener feedback. We really like to hear from you. And believe it or not, Peter, not everyone agrees with everything we say. Yeah, no. But it's good to hear it. And we love to get that feedback and think a little bit more about our positions.
Bring it on.
So the first one I want to talk about is Andrew Doyle Linden on Salt Spring Island. Says that we're too in love with Tesla. And we're not that objective when it comes to Tesla. And he's really referring to that May 16th podcast where we talk about Tesla's price-cutting strategy and how that could give them a big advantage to squeeze others out. You know, he brought forward another perspective and he sent an article, you know, that basically Tesla can't sell their cars anymore. They've saturated their market, and that's why they need to cut price. The article argues it's a luxury brand, so why would they cut prices? And one of the reasons they need to cut prices potentially, and they've saturated the market, is they don't have enough models to meet all the buyers' needs, right? Like they only have the Y is really the big seller now, right? And it, you know, depending on who you are, that's not going to be the vehicle for you.
So you want me to respond to this Tesla fanatic thing? Well, I mean, definitely. I have a lot of admiration for Tesla. I love the car. But to this point, I would argue there's really been no competition. I mean, I've been driving a Tesla since late 2014. So now with the introduction of some interesting alternatives, Audi, Mercedes, now we've got Hyundai with some very interesting models. So I think there's choice now. And I wouldn't be opposed to taking a look at these other models and seeing what they're like.
You forgot Ford too,
Ford.
by the way. Hey, but you know, one thing I will say, and I did have a dialogue with Andy on this, is the fast charging infrastructure is a real differentiator for Tesla. And you try to go on the road with another type of car and see what the charging infrastructure is like. And hey, I have actually tried it. I got the adapter so I could try a bunch of these non-Teslas. Half of them don't work. Half of them they don't sometimes flow at the rate that they say they're going to flow at. And it's not just me. I just read a couple of articles this week where people are really struggling to take these cars on the long distance. So I thought it was interesting that Ford announced with Tesla last week that they're going to get access to the Tesla charging and start to use their plug. And when you drive up with a Ford, you know, just like with a Tesla, the app is just going to know it's you and there's no like having to use your credit card or anything. I think this is going to be a huge advantage to Ford. I'm even thinking maybe I need a Ford now because they have the bi-directional and then I'm going to get the Tesla charging infrastructure. The only problem is they have those big F-150s, which I don't want to drive. But anyway, I think that's a really interesting development. If that Tesla charging infrastructure gets opened up to more cars, they become more interesting to me.
Yeah. Having said all this, I don't want to take anything away from what Elon Musk and Tesla has done. I think it's absolutely remarkable to be able to break into a century-plus old business that many have tried to break into in the past and scale up at the rate at which this company has scaled up is just amazing. And so I think they are pioneers in the space and they deserve credit for that.
Okay, another feedback. Keith McLean, a New Brunswicker that now resides in Toronto, had some feedback on our podcast about Atlantic Canada power markets. One of the comments was, we had the discussion on small modular reactors that New Brunswick is not going to be able to do that by 2035. And his point is, we shouldn't just be okay with that. There's nothing about the technology that would stop us from deploying these. It's our regulatory system that's taken too long. And we can't just accept that, okay, it'll never happen. We should be changing the regulatory system so that we can get these systems in place because Canada has a real opportunity here to be a leader in this space. And I agree with them.
Well, I totally agree. I mean, Canada was a leader in the 1950s and 60s in nuclear power, a world leader with its can-do technology. And now it's seemingly disappeared.
Yeah. You know, I do think, we've got the SMR going into Ontario now with Ontario Power Generators, but I think there is a potential if Canada really wanted to pick this as an area that we invest in, that we put those across the country, we accelerate the regulatory system so that we can be leaders in this space.
Keith, this is a much bigger issue than just even nuclear. I mean, the regulatory system is a drag on almost all types of energy infrastructural development.
Yeah, well, and that was actually acknowledged in the budget that the government wants to do consultation about how to change that. It's a big problem, but it's a problem that needs to be solved if we're going to have any chance of getting close to some of these reduction goals. So
Oh, yeah. I mean, the pursuit of net zero and transitioning energy, as we've said many times on the podcast, is not inhibited by technology. It's inhibited by legacy regulatory constructs and other geopolitical, interprovincial issues. It's much more of a social, psychological, political, regulatory bundle problem.
Yeah, not an easy problem to solve, but one that we really need to fix. And I hope that this consultation, I hope it's just not talking, that it results in change. Because as you know, with that Bill C-69 Impact Assessment Act, we actually made it more complicated in many ways.
By the way, there's nothing wrong with the regulation as long as the regulation is applied in a timely manner. And I think that's what investors, would be it utilities or others, are asking for is, look, I can't go through spending hundreds of millions of dollars on a regulatory application and wait 7 to 10 years to get approval and possibly no approval. Because if that's the game, I'm not playing.
Or at the last minute, there's a political decision that cancels your project, right? Because we have that political check at the very end. So we need to look at that whole system and improve it. But thanks, Keith, for that feedback. And I think you're right. We shouldn't accept the fact that we just can't do it in that kind of time frame.
So you got some feedback on your solar panels.
Yeah. There's been more of a discussion on Twitter with some doubt on my 7-year payback on my solar panels. And it's been good. There are a number of people that agree with me, some that don't. But the first thing I want to say is that every province of Canada, this can look a little different. So I want to talk about a few things in Alberta. Maybe they're helping me out.
You mean they're not like sunny Alberta?
Well, there's some unique things in terms of how we get paid and that sort of thing.
Okay.
Second thing is older panels are less efficient. So if you installed your panels 3-4 years ago, you're going to get different economics than what you can get today. In fact, you may have saw the picture of Peter and I. We toured Silfab Solar, which manufactures solar panels in Mississauga. And I found out that their lowest wattage panels now are 400 watts per panel, and mine were 360. So mine are already not the most efficient.
So it's already 10% more efficient.
Yeah. So that's one other difference. But I did go back and triple check my numbers. I do stick with my numbers. I think some things that make me unique is I'm using so much of my own power for charging the electric car. I think the thing about Alberta that other provinces don't have is we have a unique policy that I can sell my power when I'm a net exporter in the summer at quite a bit higher rate, 25 kilowatt hour in the summer. And then when I'm a net importer in the winter, I can switch back to the cheaper rate. So that helps me a little bit in terms of my payback too. So anyway, thank you for all that dialogue, though. I think it was helpful. Other folks that shared information on Twitter on that as well.
Yeah. So what's the email address that people can give feedback on?
Well, mainly we get the feedback. Yeah, people do email us. Our information is on our website. And also we sometimes hear through Twitter or social media feedback as well.
Good. All right. Well, until next week, thanks for joining.
Thanks for joining. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please rate us on the app that you listen to and tell someone else about us.
For more ideas and insights, visit arcenergyinstitute.com.